Are classic wet F1 races a thing of the past? Max Verstappen fears that's the case after a frustrating delay of over an hour at the Belgian Grand Prix, only for everyone to be on slicks after just 9 racing laps once it all got started. The majority of drivers, Josh Suttill, reported poor visibility on the formation lap behind the safety car, so the start was suspended, the race was red flagged and not resumed for an hour and 20 minutes. And even once it did get going, there were 4 laps behind the safety car, nobody was on full wet tyres, everyone was on the intermediates, and then after 9 proper racing laps, everyone was on slick. So why was Max Verstappen so annoyed by this?
Yeah, you might not be surprised to know that Max Verstappen was one of the biggest critics of this. We know Max absolutely loves these conditions. He feels like he can have an advantage, regardless of what setup he's got on. But obviously in this race in particular, he had gone for a very high downforce setup. Red Bull had made a lot of changes from the sprint race, and he was very much hoping that this was going to be a wet race. His new team boss, Laurent Mekies, said that they were surprised that the race didn't get underway sooner. Everything was telling them that this was the right conditions to go racing. It was interesting. Max said it made no sense to not just start the race straight away at 3 p.m. I was a bit surprised about that because the visibility was really, really poor. So I'm not sure for me Max has a case there, but I can certainly understand his frustration that later on the race wasn't started a little bit earlier.
Yeah, he'd feel very different if Red Bull had stuck to that setup that he used to such good effect in winning the sprint race. Low downforce, untouchable on the straights, but they did go for a bigger rear wing, trimmed it a little bit, but it was more downforce, and it was geared towards a wet race. As you say, your point obviously is that Red Bull, like a few other teams, were geared towards that wet race, so they lost out the most, but decisions can't be made based on that, because otherwise you do that, you harm the drivers that have gambled on it being a dry race or a mixed conditions race. So that's not really something that the FIA should factor in. I'll admit I was surprised when it got red flagged. I thought that there was no harm in doing a few laps at the start behind the safety car just to clear the water. That was one of Max's arguments, that yes, it was bad in a few places, but it could have been managed under the safety car, and then maybe take a view. In that red flag delay, we obviously had a bit more rain, we had periods of it being nice and dry, so it's kind of hard to see how it would go up there. We will pick up on Max's point about the fact that this puts basically classic wet F1 races at risk. He doesn't think that this is proper wet racing, and he even suggested that you might as well just wait until the track's fully dry before we get going. It is clearly a problem with modern F1, especially at Spa. But let's just explain why this happened the way it did. Why was race control so cautious?
This is all about the previous round in Silverstone, where basically all the drivers said to the race director and the FIA, look, you've been a little bit too extreme, can we have a bit more caution, and can we throw the yellow flags, the red flag, or the safety car a little bit sooner? So Carlos Sainz today said that actually this was a good example of the race director and the FIA listening to the drivers and enacting those changes. George Russell said the same. He said to go racing in those kind of conditions wouldn't be racing, it would be stupidity. And he very much felt the same. This was a case of the FIA listening to the drivers. Andrea Stella said the same, very much similar, didn't he? That basically this was a logical decision. So very much a bit of a split in the grid. Lewis Hamilton was another one on kind of Max Verstappen's side. Maybe a bit of a, like you say, obviously he started from the pit lane. He had much more wing as well. But again, one of those more experienced, maybe more traditional drivers. But yeah, the likes of Russell and Sainz very much supported his decision. Stella pointed out as well, obviously at Silverstone, if you remember, Isaac Hadjar went into the back of Kimi Antonelli's Mercedes just because he could not see a thing, and it was very similar conditions there. You said obviously earlier that the conditions were only bad in some places at the start of that. I think the problem is, don't know if the camera can pick it up, but over there is Eau Rouge Raidillon. Unfortunately, one of those many places was that corner, one of the most frightening on the calendar. Obviously a lot of history there, not all good. So I can kind of understand that even though there was only sort of large amounts of water in very few parts of the track, unfortunately one of those parts of the track was that corner there, and that's what a lot of drivers agreed with, including Pierre Gasly, of course, who maybe has the most personal stake in this. He felt like that was the right decision, just because it's better to be, I think in his words, 10 minutes too late than 10 minutes too early.
Yeah, exactly, and we don't need to mince our words with it. There have been fatalities there in junior categories in recent years. If there is any place on the calendar to be careful, it's here. Part of part of what feeds into that is actually one of the things about Spa, which is how much parts of the circuit are lined with trees, which means the spray that does get thrown up does hang in the air a little bit more here. And you're right, that point about Silverstone, spot on, because there were two parts of that race that were really difficult. One was when the rain came down really heavy early on and they were a bit slow putting the safety car out, see cars aquaplaning and struggling. And then, as you pointed out, Andrea Stella mentioned this, that incident with Hajar and Antonelli came under racing conditions when it was safe to actually run, but visibility was still really bad. And in the F3 race that didn't happen at the start of Sunday here, there was a shunt on the Kemmel Straight on the way up to Les Combes behind the safety car before the race had even started. So that's just the kind of thing that you're dealing with when visibility is so bad. You mentioned that obviously plenty of drivers backed the FIA. Verstappen wasn't alone in being critical of this, but definitely right to point out that the FIA had a lot of drivers on its side. But let's get on to Max's point that the F1 might as well wait for it to be dry and only run dry races if these are going to be what the wet races. Look, that's obviously exaggerated. Max doesn't mean that, and plenty of rain-hit races have happened and can still happen. Today was a rain-hit race. There were some laps in damp condition, but obviously he's after the extreme ones, like Brazil 2016, which obviously he was a star performer of, or the famous Lewis Hamilton win at Silverstone in 2008, Barcelona 96, Michael Schumacher in the Ferrari. They are harder and harder to pull off. So do we have sympathy for the likes of Verstappen and Hamilton? And how much of this is just unfortunately a reality of modern F1, especially here?
Sympathy for them and sympathy for the fans. There'll be lots of people watching this thinking, I miss the good old days when F1 cars and drivers could showcase their talents in the wet. The truth is we don't have as much of that now. And that's just the reality of modern F1 in these cars. Obviously, there are new cars next year. We'll have to see if that changes things. But this current formula is just not good for racing these conditions. And Spa is probably one of the worst tracks for that because, as you mentioned, the visibility is so bad, particularly at Eau Rouge Raidillon, and that's just the unfortunate nature of it. There's also quite a unique circumstance in that basically as soon as the rain stopped, the sun came out and the track dried quite quickly. It's obviously a very long lap here. The drainage is quite good. So a few kind of unique factors. It's probably the worst case scenario for this to happen at Spa. Yeah, and we should stress that visibility is the big factor here. There's unsurprisingly when things like this happen, a lot of people get drawn to the fact that nobody runs the wet tyre. It's on the car basically when it has to be, but everyone only wants to run on the inters and only for a few laps, and then we're all on slicks like was the case today. Now that does look bad, but a situation like today is not a direct result of the fact that the wet tyre is useless. The wet tyre is rather pointless. It still gets called the safety car tyre, but today was purely about visibility. And the problem with these cars is by the time enough water has been removed from the track surface so that visibility is not a problem, so much water has been removed that the wet is a pointless tyre to be on. And Pirelli is trying to work on this and have a wet tyre that deals with the crossover better and is a bit more like the intermediate. But we are just unfortunately in a situation at the moment where these things, they're almost unavoidable, essentially, but they do create this slightly silly look, as well as it being frustrating for the drivers, for the fans. It does. I understand it. I find it frustrating. Having to explain it every time, but I get why everyone asks the questions. But we did see a race, and that was the reason why they delayed it. They wanted to get it running at a point where hopefully we wouldn't then have to stop it, because that could have happened if it had gone green when it was meant to. The one we did see wasn't a classic wet race by any stretch. It still featured a pretty big move in damp conditions. Oscar Piastri on Lando Norris to take the lead on the first real racing lap. Unfortunately, that was the highlight. Everything after was a little bit stale. So beyond being unsuitable for wet races, is this just kind of what Spa is for F1 now? Is it a little bit underwhelming? Well, that was the problem, wasn't it? I think that's why there's so much frustration about why we couldn't get racing in the wet, because when we got racing in the dry, it was nothing short of awful, really, apart from that first lap. We saw the same on the sprint race on Saturday, probably the worst sprint since the first sprint, which was quite bad. So that's not really good. Like I say, there are new cars next year. That's like the glimmer of hope, because this formula of cars around Spa, it's special on qualifying. It's a special racetrack. But as a racing venue for F1 racing in these cars, it's completely lost its shine, unfortunately.